Chapter 15. At the other end of the short passage, Lasoni pushed off the bottom with her thick spear thighs, breaking through the surface of salty water. Coughing and sputtering, she laughed again, thinking how funny it would have been to die from drowning before making it inside. By touch alone, she found the natural steps the legend had described. Defying gravity and her fear of the dark, she climbed into the unfamiliar pitch-black void. Resting on her hands and knees, she remembered the instructions. When you reach the cave, wave your hands to dry them. Quickly, open the oilskin pouch that holds your fluff, flint, and wood bundle. Strike the flint and make your fire in the flashes of light. Now, this is most critical. As soon as the fire catches, move quickly to the sunstone. You must hurry. The air is ancient and foul. It can rob you of breath or snuff out your fire. The sunstone gives you light and air. The cave gives you water and earth, you see? As the cold threatened to distract her, she fumbled, trying to pull the bladders out of the soggy pack, despite practicing the maneuver blindfolded many times. The wax cracked off as she flexed the mouth of the container, reaching in carefully. If she dropped any of it now, she might as well just starve to death. Sparks briefly lit the space with a strike, showing a small cave. Come on, just work, damn you! Lasoni shouted, angry at the flint and her shaking, disobedient hands. With 2 more hits in rapid succession, the bundle lit. Disoriented, Lasoni tried to analyze the space quickly before the small fire was consumed. It was a half-dome hollow with a volcanic, cone-shaped top, perhaps 20 feet by 20 feet. Ah, damn it, the wood, she said, panicking in her nervous forgetting. Making a small, serviceable pyramid of kindling, she tucked the dying fire snugly inside, the twigs bursting with warm colors. Taking one of the burning sticks, Lasoni stood and spun frantically, looking, but for what? None of the wise ones could agree precisely on the sunstone's appearance. Lasoni's heart was aching so hard from the twig and stress that she almost started to cry. But then something winked the firelight back. The sunstone? She approached the small glittering disk, watching it take on the 3rd dimension as she neared. It was a simple cylinder made of bright orange quartz, about as wide as her wrist. Lasoni could tell it hadn't formed naturally, the way it protruded from the cave wall. Someone made you, didn't they? You tried to hide, but I found you, she chuckled. Curious as ever, Lasoni rubbed her leathery fingertips over the smooth, polished end of the tangerine, rusty-colored mineral. Just long enough to get 2 old, tired hands around. The fire stick bit Lasoni's hand as she thought it, forcing her to drop it with a howl of pain. Goat fucker, she hissed, trying to wave the sting away. But the burn reminded her with a start that her primary fire would also get gobbled up soon if she dallied. So with the help of a foot braced on the wall, she held fast to the slippery stone. Reaching deep into her muscle memory, she rallied all her strength for this last-ditch attempt. Thankfully, the crystal was released from the rough stone without much effort. Her muscles were already aching from walking, swimming, and freezing cold water. Take that, you bastard, she declared in triumph, glancing at the odd crystal, wondering how someone was able to polish the hard mineral to a mirror finish. Lasoni rested for a second, one hand on the wall, the other clutching the heavy cylinder, as the rush of air raised goosebumps on her arms. A single shaft of light hit her eyes, making her squint. As promised, it would be enough to aid her in completing the ceremony, making her smile with relief. Putting her nose to the cylinder borehole, she sniffed and sucked at the fresh sea air. It was a necessary reprieve from the musty odors of petrified relics and decomposition. Turning reluctantly from the vent, Lasoni quickly took in the room, readjusting her eyes to the dimly lit cave. With a shock, she realized how many dead bodies she had missed looking for the sunstone. The circumference of the cave was filled with expired medicine keepers. Analyzing them, Lasoni felt there had been no solid plan for body placement, except the path left clear to reach the sunstone. Each elder had considered the scene, then just improvised. Most of the mummies had their own spot, but as the walls closed in with corpses, the last few had been stacked on top of each other. This made her frown. It seemed a little disrespectful, the bodies touching like that, but she understood the space's limitations. Perhaps the next medicine keeper would pile her on top as well. The thought made her cringe. Exhausted, she looked to return to her fire, but next to it was the body of the last shaman, smack in the middle of the space. Hobbling over, she added a few more sticks to the tiny flame and considered her predecessor. The salty air and water had partially mummified him like jerky, but he was still fresh enough to turn Lasoni's stomach. From his physical build and the ceremonial items laid on and around him, it was apparent. An in-between. Just barely enough spear to be distinctively related to Lasoni, and so much long leg he could have passed for one of them. Again she wondered. What would her own children have looked like? Probably like this man, if she and Thoreau had been able to. "One last guilty indulgence of shame, is that it?" she said, her temper flaring. Anger, then defiance against her weaker selves, compartmentalized Lasoni's heartache. "Enough daydreaming. Get back to it." She latched onto his shoulders as gently and respectfully as possible, dragging him to an empty spot. Returning to her supplies, Lasoni got out the bladders, broke the seals, and carefully removed everything. Wishing she had brought more wood, Lasoni placed the last of it on the fire, estimating how much burn time she had left. It wasn't much, spurring her to pick up the pace. She pulled the string on the medicine roll and whipped it open with a snap. There they were, her 10 sacred ingredients. But Lasoni had to be careful, as each sleeve held just enough for one last ceremony. There was no room for error or loss from clumsy fingers. Pausing, Lasoni marveled at her most outstanding achievement. She had explored and absorbed the knowledge of each substance, each unique part of the source. And while they were all profound, stand-alone teachers, she had tuned each to its neighbor, curating a spiritual flight of synergistic revelations so powerful it was like a melody, Lasoni thought, smiling down at her spiritual instruments. Quick as a rabbit, she slid out Runine's headdress and unfurled it along with a rush of memories. She let out a sigh so deep it summed up her entire life of struggle, labor, and loss. The feathers were still soft after all this time, more delicate than anyone's skin, even the long legs. Lasoni remembered how Thoreau once trailed a feather back and forth over her skin, ending in laughter and passion. "Ha, yes, we lived, didn't we, my darling?" she declared, their triumphant love bringing her so far. Lifting the headdress to her brow, she wrapped it around her hairline and yanked the leather straps tight. Then a pinch of incense powder for the fire, for the gods. She cupped and pulled the spicy smoke over her face and arms, cleansing her earthly form. Lasoni remembered her ginger and mint plug stashed away, turning her mind back to the herbs. She fished them out of the pouch with nimble, leathery fingers, shoving one in each cheek. The sweetness reminded her why she had added the licorice. Yes, it made her happy, but its synergistic effects helped tie herbal formulas together. Like the black seed, it was yet another force multiplier, but caution was necessary if the navigator had a high pulse. Looking at the pockets of dried plants and fungi, she was thankful it would be the last time she would have to choke them down. What an ironic duality. Rapture and agony all in the same innocuous-looking bits of nature. With a bit of ginger in her system, she took the plugs out to not choke. Shit, like diving under the water again, ha, Lasoni said, trying to muster enough willpower and momentum to get through them without vomiting. She forced them down, one after another, followed by a fingertip coated in honey. Halfway through, she sat for a moment and chewed the corner off her pemmican loaf. The sweet saltiness took her mind off the horrid herbs for a blessed second. Finally, after the last herb and a swig of water, she replaced the plugs, chewing madly. Last meal indeed, she said to the sun, using one of the words Thoreau had taught her. She had perfected most of his unique lexicon, occasionally depending on a talking stick to supplement her adorable pigeon speak. As the 10 herbs bubbled up from her gut and into her mind, she felt the familiar, initial overpowering of the energizing twig. This was the first moment that separated navigation from mere inebriation. Perseverance and pushing through drowsiness or uncomfortable sensations was the whetstone that the navigators sharpened their free will power against. A novice might succumb to sleep, lust, hunger, or mental meanderings. Still, a medicine keeper pushed through, no matter what they desired. Drumming and dancing could help focus the mind in that early stage of a ceremony, burning off distracting energy. Thinking that it might be necessary, Lasoni shot up from squatting to a standing position. Bad idea. The cave was shimmering now, as the predictable groupings of effects began. Unfortunately for Lasoni, this would mean time skips on top of her already deteriorated mental faculties. Moving into a wider, more stable stance, she saw the cave anew, brighter, sharper. And there, across from her, she saw the most astounding thing of all. The walls were covered with art. "Oh, how beautiful! I never would have dreamed," she said in a sentimental, breaking tone. Had she known, she would have brought something, paint, a carving tool, or... Wait, but she did have something. Quickly, she scrambled over to her last unopened pouch, the one she had almost forgotten about. Inside, she had ferreted away yet another experiment. Pastilles of the black seed, mixed with small amounts of the 9 other herbs. Lasoni was so happy her younger, more lucid self had gifted this to her older, forgetful self. All in all, both of them had packed more than enough. Or was it exactly enough? Fate was funny that way. "Heh, good thinking us. Thank you, young one," Lasoni said, entirely at ease with the cosmic temporal joke. Time didn't mean much to her these days. She poured a little water into her hand and added all but one of the small black spheres. They expanded and dissolved just as she had engineered them to when swallowed. She blended them with the mashing of her fist, turning the mess into a thick paste. Lasoni had just transformed the most potent herbs on earth into ordinary finger paint, making her smile. Troublemaker to the end, eh? She would stamp a love letter to the next shaman, man or woman, spear or longleg, for her contribution to the wall, who, hopefully, would also smile at the animals and hand outlines. What navigator wouldn't revel in the exclusive, divine comedy of discovering such skill, such depictions in a cave of dead comrades? Her hand began tingling, prompting her to move quickly to the stone canvas. There wasn't much real estate that wasn't covered with ochre animals and negative space handprints. Happily, right in the middle, a blank space just the right size remained. She mused this was her spot, and as the firelight danced, she pressed her flattened hand firmly against the cave wall, the warm, pitch-black mixture bonding firmly to the cold stone. Perhaps too firmly, as Lasoni struggled to detach from her self-made herbal glue trap. Her hand finally released with a sticky suction sound, but it was perfect. her little addition to the collaborative mural of friends, most she had never met. Well, not yet at least. Time was funny that way too. Pleased with her work, Lasuone left the wall and hurried to the cave entrance. Crouching, she tried to wash her hand, but the mixture stubbornly remained. Frustrated, she returned to her altar. Grabbing the last black seed lozenge, she popped it in her mouth, chasing it with the last of her water. Sitting down in a meditative pose, now she was to wait for the right signs, the right moment. As the herbs and black seeds stretched time, all her fear, shame, and guilt calved off of her like icebergs, floating away into oblivion. She remembered this stage and knew that soon her identity and critical mind would also depart, kicking and screaming as they went. Usually, all those nagging voices reappeared little by little after each journey, creeping back in to bully and subjugate her free will. Lasuone let out a deep sigh, content in the knowledge she would never be burdened by them again. There would be no returning to petty worries, egoic responses, or stubborn wastes of time ruminating over pointless cat shit, as she had fondly called it. Suddenly, the tingling in her body ramped up, building into a strong, shaking vibration, and her ears were filled with the white noise of rushing water. Time. The time, is this the time? How do I... She had no memory of getting to her feet, but she was walking back to the shaft of blaring sunlight, then reaching down to pick up the golden crystal cylinder. It was painful to look at, the sun glinting off, casting a mural of stars on the walls and ceiling. Each dazzling dot pierced her eyes, refracting in her brain. With a last look at the brilliant sunrise, she positioned the stone on the lip of the cosmic peephole. Put it back. Put it back. Bye-bye, sun. I will miss you. Kiss the moon for me and... Another time skip, and she was laying on her back, the smoky perfume of incense thick and gray in the shrinking firelight. In the exact spot as the last elder, closing her eyes, she started the process of calming and centering herself. Lights and shapes danced on her eyelids as she reached for the way, the path she must take to enter the afterlife with intent. The hard rock floor underneath Lasuone softened and warmed, transforming into not rock. Her body and mind were racing against the carbon monoxide from the fire, already making her sleepy. But the twig would be enough, she hoped, to keep her lucid. Lasuone always thought she wouldn't be scared in the end. She was. She was afraid she wouldn't be able to navigate into the future. She worried that the invisible veil separating the many worlds would bounce her back, trapping her soul inside a mummified corpse surrounded by corpses forever. Breathe, Lasuone. This is who you are, a navigator, and this is just a quick sleep. But try to remember everything. With the fire almost out, she lost all sense of spatial relations. Her visions were so vivid, the colors so saturated, she felt the last doorway must be close. As soon as she finished that thought, a wave of powerful, loving energy broke over her worn and weathered body. Somehow she was young again. Every quantum particle of her form revived, painless, and mercifully detached from the ravages of time. But most importantly, she was no longer alone. Lasuone girl, I am here, I am with you, and we... The disembodied voice of her old friend ignited a blue fireball around Lasuone, filling the space between the atoms of her body. This was the gate then, the protection that she knew would be there in the end. I felt it was you, Lasuone spoke to the cobalt flames, laughing softly to her old friend, to herself, to the other medicine keepers, to eternity. But Lasuone remembered with a jolt that Runine was long dead. That meant the voice must be coming from the temple. Finally, Lasuone could repay her spiritual debt. She took a centering breath and spoke the same promise to Runine that she had made to all her past selves. The same contract to help Lasuone through every mind-bending, grueling, and tragic moment on her long journey to the now. Submit to me, and I will protect you. Lasoni whispered in her weary, aged voice, trying desperately to maintain the strength of her navigation and stay on course. What? I don't understand. Runain's spirit protested. Submit to me, and I will protect you, Lasoni repeated, struggling to stay intentional and conscious at the same time. Then, strangely, Lasoni heard the promise a third time, but in many voices from her own mouth. Was she even speaking? Submit to me, and I will protect you. A second later, Lasoni felt Runain leaving, pulled out of her, racing away like a feather floating on the cosmic river. No, please don't go, Lasoni pleaded to the auric blue light and incense smoke swirling around her. Funny you. Bye-bye, little bird. Love you. No time. Love you. Tears streaked Lasoni's temples, flowing softly into the glossy black feathers as the great mystery started to take her too. Funny you too, Runain, old friend. I know what you did now. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I love you too, Lasoni took a deep breath to continue, but left her body with a peaceful exhale. A moment later, the fire died. Soon after, her body was as cold as the deep blue waters outside. She, Lasoni, the last spear navigator on Earth.